Well, now I guess we get to the nitty-gritty of this machine, and that is the calibration. This was a fairly long-winded affair, and it took me more than 2 days with many hours each day to go through the complete procedure, section 9 in the service manual, and I'll try to go through as many of these things as I can. But first off, there's a few things to make sure that you do before you start. First thing is to demagnetize the heads and the metal parts in the tape path. That's most important. The last thing you want to do is to ruin your test cassettes. Next is to, of course, ensure that mechanically it's as good as it can be. Many of the videos up to now is to do with that, to make sure that it actually works correctly, to align the azimuth, make sure the pinch rollers are in alignment. Now, of course, the only adjustments you can make on this Pioneer for the path is the azimuth of the replay record head and the vertical position of the supply pinch roller and tape guide, and that's it. You can't alter tilt or depth or height, but that's the way it is. You need to have a good source of audio tones, for example 400 Hz, 1 kHz and maybe 15 kHz for EQ, bias and azimuth. Several blank tapes, type 1, type 2 and type 4. Now, audio meters, I do have 1 or 2 digital meters that will measure audio, but I actually acquired a number of analog meters. I found them much more easy to use when adjusting for maximums, etc., or for aligning two signals to be the same. Now, while the ones I got are fairly cheap and they're not totally accurate, on the 1 volt range they are all identical, so that's good, and they're not far out, close enough for what we're doing here, and one day I will calibrate them for each and every range. But analog meters, they're brilliant. It makes life so much better. Frequency counter, it helps to have a frequency counter. It can be either an oscilloscope that can measure it, or a proper frequency counter. It doesn't really matter. Or if you have perfect pitch, you might be able to pick it as well, but you need that. That's for adjusting the speed. As far as tapes, I acquired a torque cassette which measures the torque of the supply reel and the take-up reel when in play mode. Not for rewind and fast forward. I think that one's pretty obvious, and I didn't worry too much about those torques, but for playback torque I thought it was pretty important, so I acquired that, and the measurements for that are in another video in this series. An azimuth cassette, of course. I have a couple, but the main one I use is the 15 kHz Nakamichi azimuth tape. A Dolby level tape. Now, this depends so much on the player as to which tape you use, but you can use the same TAC Dolby level tape for each of them, provided you readjust the reading to compensate for the different nanowebers per meters. There's 160, 200 and 250 are the main types of level tapes you can get, and I adjusted the level for this accordingly to what it needs to be. Refer to the other videos. and of course a speed tape, so that you can ensure that the speed is correct, and this is where you need the frequency counter. Alright, so these are some of the things that you need to have sorted out before you start doing all of this, and it takes a lot of effort to do all this, and I'll try to go through it as best as I can. If I miss things, don't worry too much, you can work it out, but what I aim to do is to point out some of the I guess major discrepancies that I found, and we'll go from there. Alright, let's go. I didn't immediately do section 9.2. I tended to not worry about that at this point, and I believe I did it later on just as a check. This requires the use of a calibrated cassette. Now, Pioneer recommend a 160 nanoweber per meter tape, which I believe would set it to around about 0 dB on the meter, but you don't actually set it for 0 dB. You actually set it for approximately 0.7 volts at the test point terminals, which so basically the VU meter is irrelevant to setting the playback level. Now, since I'm using a 200 nanoweber per meter tape, so we have to do a different voltage, and as you can see up in the top right hand under 9.3.2, I adjust the VR104 and VR103 so that I get 1.4 volts instead of 1.12, which is for the lower 160 nanoweber per meter tape. So we set that for 1.4 volts using my standard TEC 200 nanoweber per meter tape. The next thing to do is to adjust the level meter to show this. To set the level meters, you adjust the input voltage to be a certain amount at a certain test point, in this case test points 29 and 30, and then once that's set, you then adjust a couple of tweaks to set the meter to be 0. So you insert 316 millivolts RMS at 333 Hertz, which is 0.894 volts peak to peak, and then you adjust at the two test points the reading to be 1.974 volts peak to peak, or 700 millivolts RMS, or average. It's close enough. Once you've done that, you've got the right voltage going into it and amplified correctly. So then you adjust VR801 and VR802 and adjust so that the meter readings are at 0 dB for that particular input. Once again, follow the procedure. Just take your time. The level of 316 millivolt, once again, that is also 0.894 volts peak to peak. A lot of the time I was using an oscilloscope, and it was easier to measure peak to peak than it was average or RMS. The adjustments are VR205 and VR206. Just follow it cleanly and you'll be okay. Now the following section, 9.6 and 9.7, I eventually did get around to doing those, but the first time round I was loath to adjust them, the erasure current and the bias trap adjustment. They're fairly I won't say minor, but they're basically final adjustments to get the best out of it all, and not necessarily that you need to do those. I did in the end, and that's why I took over 2 days to do all these adjustments. It was a bit of a nightmare, but I wouldn't worry about these, especially the first time through this, and you may well find that you get the full performance out of it without adjusting these two. So let's move on to the next section. Sections 9.8 through 9.10. I won't say they're straightforward, but they work, and you just need to take your time, understand which adjustments you're making, and follow the levels to the letter of the law, so to speak, and you'll be fine. The second part of section 9.10 I didn't actually do. From section 6 to 11 I didn't do, and the reason, well, I think I just felt it was unnecessary. A lot of it is simply confirming what it should be, and if you're willing to do that, well, fair enough. I didn't do that. Once again, with section 9.11, you follow it religiously. The main thing to note is that in section 9.11 part 3 is that it's not made clear where you actually measure the level. The assumption is that you measure it at test points 29 and 30 as in the previous part, but no, you don't. You actually measure it on the output terminals of the deck, what goes out of the deck into the amplifier. At that point there, if you look at the circuit, it's actually fairly obvious that you need to do that, because measuring at 29 and 30, adjustments of 205, 206 don't do a damn thing, and when you see the circuit, you'll see why it doesn't do anything. But you measure it at the output of the machine, and all is good, and you can adjust it for the right level at 750 millivolts. That's all to say for that. The final anomaly is in section 9.12 part 2. It says there to adjust the input level controls. Now that could arguably mean some of these presets, or even the input level controls on the front of the machine. No, it does not mean that. What it means is the actual generator output going to the input connectors on the machine. And if you look at my sheet there, you'll see some of the values that I've got, and in this case it's 0.099 volts peak to peak. With VR103 and VR104 set to minimum, this generator output gives you, in my instance, the level of 700 millivolts at test point 16 and 15. So that's what you're aiming for. 103, 104 set to minimum, and you adjust the signal going into the machine, or the generator output, so that you get 700 millivolts at test points 15 and 16. Yes, it's not quite clear, but that's what you do. Note that in section 9.12 part 3, the adjustment of 107 and 108 is done in play mode. That's important. I haven't gone through the procedure little bit by little bit, showing every tweak, because overall it took me it must have been nearly 20 hours, at least 2 days doing these adjustments. So providing a blow-by-blow tweak would be boring to the utter extreme. So you need to follow their procedure fairly religiously, but remembering those 2 or 3 things that I mentioned where they didn't quite explain properly what they were aiming for. Finally, this drawing shows the position of VR201. It's underneath, right in the center of the PCB, so you need to take off the bottom cover to get to it. Have a good look through all the different pictures I've provided, and the little sketchy notes I've made in the calibration and the schematic, and get to know the machine until you're quite comfortable with it. I ended up having to go through many of the calibration procedures more than once, because I felt I just didn't understand exactly what was required. But in the end, I managed to get it all okay, in my opinion. It's not an easy machine, and I wish you the best of luck with it, and I'll try and help where I can. It's actually been many months since I've done this, so trying to refresh my memory is not easy. All right, good night all. Once again, nice machine, but good luck with it.